Well, welcome everybody. It's 5:03, so let's jump into our conversation. And as people continue to join us, we will expand our space to welcome them in. I'm Rabbi Jessica Graf, and really delighted to welcome you to this particular conversation in our series From the Front Lines at Congregation Shereth Israel. We discovered that there's so many things happening in our world all the time, that discussing them here together with our trusted friends and teachers and advisors is a great way to put them in a Jewish context and to help us understand the world through a Jewish lens. So we live in a pretty complicated world these days. I think it's always been complicated, but as it continues to be so, we value ever more the relationships that we have with each other and within community. So welcome today. We will be hosting, just the origin of today's conversation. I'll give you a tiny bit of background. We're going to be hosting a citywide conversation teach-in on the topic of reparations in the San Francisco community anyway, on Sunday, September 18th. And we at Congregation Shereth Israel were invited to host this. It's a project of the Jewish Dialogue Group and a couple of Black churches, some prominent leaders in the community who have brought together a really important array of speakers so that we can learn more about this topic. I felt strongly that if we were going to host this for the city, we should begin this conversation by hosting a Jewish, specifically Jewish version of this so that we could understand the context in Jewish text and Jewish experience of what this conversation is about. So today's conversation is about the Jewish community beginning to talk about, learn about, continuing to talk about and learn about the idea of reparations, specifically with the Black community. And as we've talked about in preparing for today, the word reparations gets used in a lot of different places. Of course, there are Jewish reparations from Germany and many other communities who have suffered. And we've talked about the need for other reparations to be considered. But today's conversation is specifically to talk about, through a Jewish lens, what we might consider being a Jewish approach to talking about reparations with the Black community. So I'm really delighted to have two experts in the field of Jewish text and Jewish experience. Christina Jefferson, all of you know, or most of you know, she's not only a member of our board of trustees, but she's the chair of our inclusion committee, and she's spoken a bit. Today we have a great privilege to learn more about her experience as a Jew of color and to hear her experience with this topic. She's spoken nationally on this, and we're really lucky to have her here today. A moment of formal bio. Christina Jefferson is the first ever Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the San Francisco 49ers. She leads inclusion and diversity efforts across the organization and leads the team's internships, fellowships, and holistic training strategy. So in addition, she is a leader in many organizations in the Jewish world, and including ours. We're delighted to have you, Christina. Thank you for agreeing to present on this really important topic. Christina will be in dialogue with Rabbi Aryeh Bernstein, and thank you for joining us, Rabbi, from Chicago. Rabbi Bernstein has a pretty varied educational background, I would say, kind of in all of the movements. If I can, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that he's dipped into Jewish studies really around the Jewish world, and that provides a richness to your ability to teach text. He's an expert specifically in the area of text with regard to reparations and has written extensively about this and taught on this nationwide. And we're really, really lucky to have you here to help educate us today, both of you. So thank you to both of you, and I'll let you jump in and begin our conversation. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Good to be here.
I am so pleased to be here as well, and thank you, Rabbi Aryeh, for agreeing to speak with us today. I'm going to start off our conversation today, everybody. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Christina Jefferson, pronouns she, her, hers, and I'm a member of this amazing congregation. And again, thank you so much for learning today with all of us. I'm going to start with a story. For those of you who may have heard me speak before, you might know parts of this story, but I hope you find something new and interesting about it. In Colonial Caroline, A History of Caroline County, Virginia, published in 1954 by T.E. Campbell, there's a section called The Peddlers. Several peddlers moved about the countryside in Caroline during colonial times, selling goods. All of the men of record were Jews. The most troublesome peddler in Caroline County's history was Mordecai Abraham. He arrived in Caroline sometime prior to 1751 and began traveling the county with Henry Thomas, an indentured servant. His troubles began because the law forbade Jews, Muslims, and Negroes to own indentured servants. After he had to give up ownership, he purchased another poor debtor. This servant complained about being owned by a Jewish person as well. Mordecai convinced the court that the law barring Jews from owning white servants only applied to servants brought in from abroad and did not apply to persons bound in Virginia. This judgment in his favor was reversed, eventually forcing Mordecai to free that man. After this, Mordecai decided to buy a Negro. The law did not forbid a Jew to own a Negro slave. There's an uncomfortable conversation about who has owned whom and who has benefited from that system. Who has benefited from the system and foundations of slavery? My wife, most of you know, Julie, and I started to research the land in Caroline County because during the pandemic, we bought most of my family's farm there, a place that's been in my family since at least 1929. I spent my summers on that farm, helping my great uncles with his hunting dogs and occasionally helping with the harvest when I got bored of playing with my cousins on the rural country roads. Researching that land set off a chain reaction of learning and connections and uncomfortable truths. We can only research the land so far before it gets complicated. Records are sparse and my family history is complicated. My ancestry is Native American, Powhatan tribe, Black enslaved people, white plantation owners, and Irish. In one census record, a person is labeled Negro. And the next, the same person is labeled mulatto, and in some cases even white. And if you try to trace back farther than 1870, we kept hitting the wall of slavery and the burning of so many records in Virginia from the Civil War. We have to hope that there are some records that are just not available online or actually in the courthouse. We still pick up the books from time to time and start to try and research online, but it's incredibly time-consuming work, and it's sometimes really frustrating. Trying to understand who owned who at what time, trying to figure out the plantation that they could have been on, reading volumes and volumes about the white plantation owners just to try to find a glimpse of my family. Researching those beautiful plantations that are being restored beam by beam, only on land that was stolen from some of my ancestors, lived on by some of my other ancestors, and built by some of my other ancestors. Like I said, it's uncomfortable truths and connections. Understanding that I'm a rare Black and Native American person who still has a piece of my own history, who has a bit of that generational wealth to be able to buy the land that I spent my summers on. Honestly, we wouldn't have been able to afford that land had it not been for my aunts and my uncle who gave me my mother of blessed memories inheritance, just to help us with the down payment. This is generational wealth. Having land that's in your family, that's yours to help your family with mortgages, to pay bills, to pay colleges, unexpected expenses, being able to pass more than just pieces of memory, pieces of history, not just an heirloom, but being able to help the next generation. Owning land is an experience many Black people were and are still shut out from. My mother and biological father's family are the tale of two Americas, two Black Americas. My grandfather's family, the Thomases, owned the farm in Caroline County. land that they worked, and we believe they were enslaved on. My grandmother's maiden name was Miles, and her family is from Richmond, Virginia, and they owned a home in downtown Richmond, something that most Black families just couldn't afford, especially not in the part of Richmond that is considered nice. My grandmother, Olita Thomas of blessed memory, was the first of her generation of my grandparents to go to college. She got her master's degree eventually in chemistry. My grandmother and her sisters were what we now call racially ambiguous and were afforded many opportunities that other Black people of color didn't have. But they were still people of color. My mother and her sisters were born in the Jim Crow South, just like my grandparents. One of the remnants of this was my mother never learned to swim. Richmond decided, instead of integrating their pools, that they were just going to close all their public pools, and didn't reopen for 10 years, reopening in 1967. My grandparents had the means to move north out of the South and moved to St. Louis. I grew up knowing my grandparents moved for my grandmother, and I knew it was so that she could have better opportunities as a chemistry teacher. But it wasn't until adulthood that I learned of a letter that she wrote to the Richmond, Virginia newspaper in reference to an advertisement for a laboratory specialist, asking, why does the state not consider a qualified Negro for the position? My grandmother graduated cum laude and was questioned for this position, or was qualified for this position in every way except her complexion. I spent so many of my summers hanging out in her classrooms as she taught summer school or did lessons plans. I loved hanging out with my mother's parents. Sometimes we would spend all summer there in St. Louis, or they would drive us down to Virginia to the family farm. But most years we just stayed in St. Louis. I loved my grandparents' house. Their house was huge. Their yard was huge. They had this huge big screen TV with a projector, for those of you who remember the projector TVs. There was a cabinet in their house, I'll never forget, that only had cookies and candy. That's all that was in the entire closet. It was like the dream of grandchildren. It was a big difference from the townhome that I grew up in with my mom and my brother. I was lucky that most of my grandparents lived in St. Louis. So when we came to town from Indianapolis, we were able to visit all of my grandparents in the same trip, or most of them anyway. When we would go to my grandmother's house on my biological father's side, there was always prep and a pep talk. My father was born and raised in St. Louis. Actually, he was born and raised in Kinloch, which is the oldest Black city in Missouri. It didn't start out as a Black city. It started out as a white suburb, but once one Black family moved in, the white families moved out. Because it wasn't a city yet, the racial covenants that had become so popular were not in place to keep Black families from moving in. In The Color of Law, Richard Rothstein discusses the Federal Housing Administration, or FHA, established in 1934. And they refused to issue mortgages in and near African-American neighborhoods, color coding the area red, a policy known as redlining. Redlining and racial and restrictive covenants' goal was to keep neighborhoods segregated. They would often zone Black neighborhoods for industrial use, mixed housing, placing and pushing them into undesirable locations of the city. For Kinloch, this meant being next to the airport. And in the 80s, when I would visit my grandmother's house in Kinloch, it was being bought up by the nearby St. Louis airport. The city of St. Louis was buying out families, and what was left was a shell. A once thriving city was gone, most residents moving to places like Ferguson or out of state. But in the 80s, my grandmother lived there, playing or watching her neighbors leave in droves. Her house was so small, and it was too dangerous to play outside. It was a one-bedroom without a tub. So when we would go over there, we were never allowed to stay overnight. And I think once I have this very little memory of me taking a bath in a tin tub when I was a kid. When we would visit there, we would drive from the affluent Florissant, this beautiful part, sprawling neighborhood, to Kinloch, this tiny, tiny place. My mother would tell us and remind us to not say anything rude. We were children. We weren't even 10 when we first started going there. Reminding us to say thank you, to take what is offered, to be gracious. She and everyone else who lived in Kinloch were doing the best in their circumstances. I didn't understand why Kinloch was so different. In 2000, the Riverfront Times reported that half of the residents of Kinloch in the last census had an annual income of less than $10,000. The average house that was selling, that the airport was buying, was $25,000. The Brookings Institution reported that in 2016, at $171,000, the net worth of a typical white family is nearly 10 times that, 10 times greater than that of a Black family at $17,150. My grandmother finally moved in the 90s, one of the last to leave, and moved in with one of my aunts in Indianapolis. Kinloch, once a thriving and beautiful city of over 50,000 residents, is now down to less than 300 people. And the airport still hasn't done anything with that land. Reparations are about generations of wealth that never were. The only way for my biological father, or the only way he felt he could get out of Kinloch, was to get an education, and that was to join the Army. He was the first generation in his family, or among the first generation in his family, to get to go to college, and he did it on the GI Bill. A generation before, if he had entered a generation before in the Army, the GI Bill's housing benefits, specifically loans to help those who served our country afford to buy a home, were tied to FHA mortgages. In order for a bank to give you a loan, you had to be able to get a mortgage through the FHA, the Federal Housing Administration. These are the same folks that we just talked about who were not issuing mortgages and loans in Black neighborhoods and cities such as Kinloch. So one of the biggest ways that veterans were able to buy homes, buy houses, get generational wealth, build things like a future for their families that were passed on from generation to generation, were often not available to Black veterans. On my mother's side, I'm a third generation woman with their master's degree. When my grandparents on my mother's side passed away, the house in Florissant had maintained its value for the most part. And the inheritance was passed on to my aunts and my uncle and me. I paid off most of my first student loan. When my father's mother passed away in Indianapolis, to my knowledge, she wasn't able to pass on anything to her children. Reparations are about connections to our past and future. Connections and reverberations, connections that sometimes you don't even see. My family's story is just one of many Black families' histories in this country. In doing my research and doing our research about my family's land, I learned so much. How many stumbling blocks and walls have been put in the way of Black people in this country. How the simple act of owning property sets off a chain reaction of generational wealth, or can keep each generation digging themselves out of an endless pit. Reparations are about that pit. How the pit was made by slavery. How it was made deeper by the failed Reconstruction of the 1870s and the stolen savings of enslaved people through the Freedmen's Bureau Savings Bank by the federal government. And deeper by Jim Crow laws that my grandparents and my parents grew up in. And deeper, as described so eloquently in The Color of Law, by denials of FHA mortgages, GI Bill inequities, the New Deal of the 1930s, and its exclusion of historically Black occupations such as agriculture and domestic servants from Social Security, minimum wage protection, and the recognition by labor unions. It can take generations to build generational wealth. So what happens when you can't benefit from any of the things that help you build that wealth? And if the roadblocks to that wealth are institutionalized, built into the very foundations of who we are. Rabbi Sharon Brous discussed in Our Country Was Built on a Stolen Beam, the call for a national reckoning, one of my favorite passages in the Talmud, that there is a dispute between rabbis, what we ought to do if a house, maybe even a beautiful palace, is built on the foundation of a stolen beam. Shammai argues, we must tear down the house to retrieve the beam and return it to its rightful owner. You can't build something on a beautiful lie. Rabbi Brous goes on to say, Hillel counters with, let the thief pay for the beam, for the value of the beam. But both rabbis insist something must be done to rectify the injury. We can't tear down the house because we're all living inside it. But we can pay for the value of the house that we all live in. I think that's what's uncomfortable about reparations and the truth about it. We as Americans realize that this country was built on stolen labor. It was built on many, many, many stolen beams. And how can you put a value on this? It's such a big task, and the value is almost too big to calculate. And this brings me to my favorite quote from Pirkei Avot. Shout out to Pirkei Avot class. My job working in diversity, equity, and inclusion can feel endless, and it's sometimes hopeless. But I have a post-it on my desk that reminds me every day of why I do this job. It's from Rabbi Tarfon. It is not up to you to finish the task, but you are not free to avoid it. Thanks, y'all. I'm now going to turn it over for some amazing learning. I'm so excited for this, to Rabbi Bernstein.
Thank you so much, Christina, for the gracious welcome and for the really gripping story, a story that's a microcosm of this country and all that is complex about it. It's wonderful to be here. My name is Aryeh Bernstein. I am calling from the ancestral lands of the Ottawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi peoples on the southwest coast of Lake Michigan in Chicago, and it's a joy to be with you together. If there's been any silver lining of this awful, awful pandemic with so much suffering, it's that it's taught us how to actually connect over Torah study and things that matter with people in all sorts of different places. I will hold the mic closer to my mouth over here. Thank you. I also want to acknowledge my old friend, Rabbi Phelps, who I did not know had an association to the synagogue until seeing you here. It's great to be with you. We're going to jump into some Torah study. Before we do that, I want to just acknowledge the kind of genealogy of my own learning in this topic. In 2014, journalist, writer Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote what is, in my opinion, one of the most important pieces of political writing of this century, an article that was published in The Atlantic called The Case for Reparations. Part of what's elegant about it, Coates is far from the first to write eloquently and persuasively about reparations, and yet somehow struck a chord around which the national conversation really shifted. Things are never about one person. I'm sure that he wouldn't want to accept credit for that. And yet that's a time combined with a lot of other discussions where things really shifted, including for me. Reparations, even as I was somebody who was always concerned about racial injustice and justice, or saw myself that way, reparations had been a topic that I hadn't seriously considered. To the extent I'd heard about it, I'd probably categorized it as a kind of wild, radical, extreme position, not with any significant thought. And Coates's article really laid bare in one of the striking passages that beneath the mockery of reparations is actually nervous laughter, that it's the simplicity of the case for reparations that is what makes people nervous. The nervousness and the need to push away is about not the extremity of the position, but the extremity of the sin, the extremity of the theft that has been snowballing for 400 years. So with that background, I just want to acknowledge anybody who, if you haven't read it, I strongly recommend it. It's just a magnificent piece of writing, which you can access for free. Just Google The Case for Reparations, Atlantic. It's in the Atlantic from 2014, and it's also reprinted in his marvelous book of collections of essays from the Obama presidency years, book volume called We Were 8 Years in Power. So recommended reading. As I was reading that, Torah text that I have read, studied many times for decades showed up in front of my eyes in ways that were so obvious and yet I'd never seen before. Things about our own Torah that I had seen but not seen. So I'm going to share some of those passages, what I think is the basis for the Torah Case for Reparations, which is the name of an article that I published in 2018, and be happy to share the link with you. Okay, I'm going to share my screen now, and we'll be doing some text study together. All right. The major story, the Jewish people's main story, this isn't anything surprising to hear. I think if somebody arrived from Mars and met you and you said, yeah, I'm Jewish, and they might ask, well, what's the one Jewish story that sums up what your people is about? Probably most of us would say the Exodus from Egypt. It's something that in every ritual we recall, every joyous holiday, we sing Hallel psalms that poetically narrate the liberation from Egypt. Every time we make Kiddush on Shabbat, Friday night, we say that we affirm that it is Zecher L'Tziat Mitzrayim, in memory of the Exodus from Egypt. That's our major story. That is who we are. It is impossible to construct a religious, scriptural, or mythic Jewish identity that doesn't center on the Exodus from slavery in Egypt. In the Torah, the Israelites' exodus from Egypt is narrated to include the taking of wealth from the Egyptians. And that is from the very first time that the fact of slavery is revealed that is going to happen, throughout the preparation for the liberation and the narration of the liberation itself. Let's look at those 4 biblical texts and ask, what can we learn about about slavery, systemic oppression, and poverty, and about their repair? So let's start with, in the book of Genesis, the first book of the Torah, Bereshit, the great reveal, long before slavery happens, long before a descent to Egypt, we have the great reveal. Abraham, 3 chapters after he comes on the scene at age 75 and answers the call of a God he's never heard of before to leave everything he knows and go to a land, and he'll find out when he gets there. He has amazing trials and tribulations in the next 3 chapters. And as he's achieved fame and wealth and built altars to God, he has a moment of crisis, asking God, wait a second, I'm an old man. I'm over 75 and I have no children. I have no heirs. What's the purpose of this legacy that I'm building without heirs? That's Abraham's anxiety. He has no anxiety about wealth. He has anxiety about descendants. God responds to him in a very trippy scene and assures him that he will have abundant descendants, and tells him as follows. God said to Avram, know for sure that your seed shall be an alien in a land not their own. So as soon as he tells him you're going to have lots of descendants, immediately hits him with bad news. So they're going to be undocumented immigrants in a foreign place, and they shall serve them. They're going to be slaves too. And they shall abuse them 400 years. And also that nation whom they shall serve will I judge. And afterward, they shall come out with significant property. The very first time we're told that slavery is going to happen, we're told that liberation will come, and liberation is liberation with property. They shall come out with significant property. Avram had not asked about money. He didn't have anxiety about that. He's a wealthy man. His anxiety is about a future. There's a future. It's going to be complicated. You will have seed. They will be slaves, but they will come out with significant property. Jump forward to the 3rd chapter of the book of Shemot, Exodus. By this point, there's been a regime change after, Abraham's great-grandchildren were welcomed in Egypt, and they lived there successfully as a protected immigrant class for a long time. But then there's a regime change in chapter 1 of Exodus, and the Israelites are plunged into slavery, and God hears their cries. Moshe, the fugitive, in Midianite desert, encounters a burning bush and has a negotiation with God, who's sending him back to liberate his people. And God knows it's not going to be easy. I know the king of Egypt will not let you go except by a mighty hand. And I will send my hand and smite Egypt with all my wonders, which I will do in its midst. And after that, he will let you go. And I will give this people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, so that when you go, you will not go empty. Lo telchu rekam. But every woman shall ask of her neighbor and of the one lodging in her house silver items and gold items and clothing. And you shall put them upon your sons and upon your daughters, and you shall clean out the Egyptians. If that phrase clean out sounds a little bit slangy or idiomatic, I'm trying to capture, it's a sort of funny Hebrew word there, v'nitzaltem et Mitzrayim. The root, natsal, really means to move something from one place to another place, from a place that doesn't belong to a place that does belong. At the punishment for the golden calf, that root is used to describe the stripping of the Israelites of their gold jewelry, which they don't deserve to wear anymore. The word lahatzil in the causative means salvation, to save. And the sense here, and in modern Hebrew, it also means to exploit. And the sense here is that you're going to be kind of cleaning the Egyptians' clock. You're not just going to take some stuff, you're really going to clean them out, empty them out. As a nice sandwich to what it said at the beginning, you will not go empty. And it's not going to be achieved through magic, but that individual people who have been oppressed for hundreds of years will go to the Egyptians next to them, the neighbors who have a lot of property, and say, hand me your stuff. That's what God says to Moshe. Jump forward 8 chapters, and a year later, Egypt is now in free fall. The 9 plagues in. Pharaoh is still recalcitrant, refusing to let them free, but slavery has de facto ended at this point, with all the Egyptian agriculture has been decimated by the plagues, the plague of darkness, there have been deaths. Egypt is a mess. Adonai says to Moshe, one more plague will I bring upon Pharaoh and upon Egypt. Afterwards, he will send you out of here. When he sends you out, he will completely expel you from here. No ifs, ands, or buts. Speak, please, in the ears of the people, that they may ask, each man of his neighbor and each woman of her neighbor, silver items and gold items. And Adonai gave the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians. Moreover, the man Moshe was very great in the land of Egypt, in the sight of Pharaoh's servants, and in the sight of the people. A strange thing about this passage, what's not strange is, so like on the night before, God's reminding Moshe, remember that thing I told you a year ago and I mapped this all out? It's all happened. And the last stage is going to happen. Don't forget. But notice that God says, please, daber na. Na, meaning please, is a biblical language that is always stated by a subordinate toward a superior. For example, when Moshe prays to God to heal Miriam, El na refa na la, which perhaps you've heard a song with that verse. Moshe says please to God. Why is God pleading with Moshe? I would think taking Egyptian property is something that is the right of the Israelites. But in it being a plea from God, we get the literary sense that something is fundamentally broken with this liberation if they don't do this. For God's plan to work, for the liberation to be divine, they have to do this step. And it can't happen through God working some magic. They have to do it. Please don't skip this step. They might want to say, I just want to get out of here as soon as possible. It's too embarrassing and awkward to go confront our neighbors, God says, please, Moshe, don't let them forget this debt. And finally, the narration of it actually happening. Chapter 12 of the book of Shemot, of Exodus, and it happened at midnight. Adonai smote every firstborn in the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh rose up in the night. And he called for Moshe and Aaron by night and said, get up, get out from among my people, you and the children of Israel, and go, serve Adonai as you have said. Take both your flocks and your herds as you have said, and go, and bless me also. And the Egyptians urged the people on to rush to send them out of the land, for they said, we'll all be dead. And the people took their dough before it was leavened, their kneading troughs being bound up in their clothes upon their shoulders. And the children of Israel did according to the word of Moshe. And they asked of the Egyptians silver items and gold items and clothing. And Adonai gave the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, so that they let them have what they asked. So they cleaned out the Egyptians. A few things I want to highlight. Every time the Torah talks about liberation from Egypt, it's liberation from Egypt with significant Egyptian property. And if that hasn't been part of your perception of these texts previously, or it's not how we've heard it in our Hebrew school education or wherever we've encountered this, it's interesting to ask why not. What was going on in 20th century American Judaism with regard to this very blatant, obvious component of the story? To put it bluntly, the biblical story of Yetziat Mitzrayim, of the Exodus from Egypt, is the Exodus from Egypt with reparations. There is no Exodus without reparations. There's no liberation without reparations. It's integral to the story. To the extent that in the narration of it actually happening here in chapter 12, the people are in such a hurry that they rush and grab their bread from the oven before it can rise. We have to eat matzah, the major mitzvah of Pesach, because we were in such a hurry we couldn't let it rise. But we weren't in such a hurry to leave. We were in such a hurry to go door to door demanding the property be handed over. That happened after they took the matzah out of the oven. They still had time for that. It was that essential to the liberation story. Maybe I've been overframing this by describing it as reparations. That word isn't used, that concept wasn't used. It's not stated explicitly in these biblical passages that the meaning of this wealth is reparations. Maybe it's just that God likes the Jewish people, the Israelites, better than the Egyptians and wants us to have their stuff. I don't know. But universally in the rabbinic tradition, I'll skip that text for now. I want to just point your attention briefly to a piquant story in the Talmud Bavli tractate Sanhedrin. This is the basic text where the Talmud addresses this piece of our history. And it imagines this fantastical international lawsuit in the court of Alexander the Great. So set hundreds of years before the rabbis telling the story. We shouldn't relate to this as archival history, but as mythic memory making. And imagines the Egyptians suing the Jewish people in at the Hague, to use our idiom, suing us for reparations because they quote the Torah and saying, God gave the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, so they lent to them. The word sha'al, which we translated before as they asked of them, also means borrow, and they lent. So the Egyptians years later are saying, hey, it was a loan. We were lending you some stuff for your festival to go out for 3 days and then come back. You're supposed to give us back our property. Give us the silver and gold you took for us. If it seems fantastical to you that the rich power, Egypt, would sue the previously oppressed class for reparations, just remind us that that's less fantastical in terms of actual practice in the world than the oppressed class who's been stolen from for reparations. Haiti paid reparations to France for many, many generations because of the money stolen from France by Haiti not being a colony anymore and overthrowing their colonizers. Similarly, when Argentina nationalized the oil that's in Argentinian land, Spain made a fuss and sued Argentina for reparations for the money lost to private Spanish corporations who should have been, from their perspective, controlling the oil. That is what we call in rabbinic idiom, ma'asim shebechol yom, events that happen every day. In any event, so the Egyptians come and sue the Jewish people for reparations. And to cut to the chase of the story, the Jewish lawyer here named Gavia ben Pesisa makes the argument back. It's like, well, if you're quoting the Torah, why don't you quote 4 verses later than the verse you quoted, which is that the Israelites' residence, which they resided in Egypt, was 430 years. Give us payment for the labor of 600,000 whom you enslaved in Egypt for 430 years. Mic drop. Now, in this mythic retelling of a fantasy story, Alexander the Great says, okay, you know, we give a response because now you've been countersued, the Jews countersued you, and the Egyptians never show up back in court. And happily ever after, in other words, from the rabbinic perspective, the wealth that we took on the way out of Egypt was meant to be reparations for the labor that we took. In fact, you want to play that game, you want to take out your calculators and pens and paper, you probably would still owe us more. But you're lucky, this is what we made it out with. And if you don't like the fact that it was all at once and it was a balagan and it was like in this sloppy way, well, then you better set up that claims committee and the reparations governmental committee. That wasn't going to happen with Pharaoh in Egypt. They took what they could. And even though one of the consequences of all this wealth all of a sudden, they did good things with it. They built the tabernacle, made it possible to play a home for God, and they did bad stuff. They built a golden calf. Never once does the Talmud or the Torah ever regret giving the Israelites permission and commandments to take this property. Even though the argument though about how do we know that the person's going to do good things with it, totally irrelevant. It's their property. And you're not allowed to build a golden calf. And if you do, then you'll be in big trouble. But the property was theirs. I'm going to pause it there, and now Christina and I will have a conversation. There's a lot more in the textual tradition that we could discuss, but I just want to lay out that my fundamental spiritual political claim is that for Jews who are animated by Torah, it is incoherent to oppose reparations, at least in principle. There could still be lots of conversation about what they look like, what the process would be. And what's elegant about the conclusion of Ta-Nehisi Coates's article is he's concluding by saying we should be passing this bill that's been submitted to the House of Representatives for, at that point, 34 years, now longer than that, HR 40, calling to fund and create a congressional committee to study reparations for African Americans and see what it would look like, how much, what process. Let's actually study it seriously and not treating it as a joke or as something to be afraid of. It is incoherent for a Jew who's animated by Torah to oppose that. We have no story without reparations. Reparations are totally foundational to our identity of who we are. And I would like to think that they're foundational to how we operate politically in this country. I'll pause there and turn it over to Christina for some conversation.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny, when we were talking earlier, I was am and still a little jet lagged, so I'm like in a different place than I was like an hour ago. Because what I loved about how you started your part of this conversation, of your teaching, is the idea that to look at it anew, to have had something inspire you to look at our text in a new way. And I think because how many times I think we all read the golden calf story, and I think that was one of my favorite parts of your article, was really thinking about how often I hear the idea that, well, why would we give reparations to Black people? Because what are they going to do with it? And what I thought you did so beautifully is just talk about the golden calf story in that same way. Like, well, we haven't done all this amazing stuff in our history, so why is it that and like, there's some other pieces to that. So I would love for you to talk a little bit more about that piece of the text and your understanding of like what we did with the things that we took in reparations, and just because I think it's just fascinating and beautiful to talk about.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, I think, the after history of reparations in the Torah is both the most positive and the most negative, which is to be expected from money and people. And people are both extremely generous and worshipful and communitarian, and people are also garbage sometimes and do terrible, hurtful things. And whenever somebody says, well, there's reparations, like, what if Black people do bad things with the money? Oh, but all the white people who have extra inherited wealth that is ill-begotten, some of that is used for generous things, and some of it also goes to drugs and to hurtful, buying guns and shooting people. Like, people do what they do, and when people do things that they shouldn't do with their property, the society has all sorts of mechanisms to prosecute, to deal with that. And yeah, I can guarantee for sure, because Black people are people. So like, if and when, Bezrat Hashem, with the help of God, like, reparations become a reality in this country, just like everybody now and then in all times with money and property, some people will do some like wonderful things and endure security for their families and make sure that people get proper like medical treatment and higher education and even cultural centers and do wonderful things. And people will do terrible things with it, the same as it exists in whoever's hands. But that's not the point. And Coates writes about this very elegantly. And the only reason I really engaged in even that exploration in the article is because so many people make what, in my opinion, are bad faith arguments. It's really the question of what will happen with it is a separate question. It's not. It's theirs. It's yours. It's when something has been stolen from you. Veheshiva tagzela, as the Torah says, when something is burglarized, it has to be returned. And there's been a tremendous, generations-long burglarization of the bodies of Africans and of their property after that, or preventing property from coming to them. And there's something very elegant that our tradition doesn't leave us room, in my opinion, religiously, to say, I don't know, it was so long ago. I mean, this, the money, the property that's taken out of Egypt is right on at the beginning of the liberation. But this lawsuit is imagined to be happening many centuries later. And you see the ongoing legal claims that are going. In fact, in the context of the story, Egypt even abandoned certain other properties that then the Jewish people claim, with the implication that it was theirs too. So yeah, I think these sources are very clarifying, and our midrashim, rabbinic exegesis of some of the stories about the golden calf and about the Mishkan, the tabernacle, this glorious home that enables God to dwell among the people. We know that the direct encounter at Revelation of Mount Sinai, it was too difficult for the people to have God that close, and they needed to have a place for God's proximity, for God's intimacy with the Jewish people. That was made with gold and silver and fabrics. And we know where they got them from. And the golden calf was too. And many people got rightfully punished harshly for building a golden calf. And despite that, with all the narratives about that, nobody in the Talmud ever says, maybe God shouldn't have had the people take property out of it. That's never questioned. It's totally irrelevant.
Yeah. I mean, I think, again, just the fact that we revisit this every year, and to understand and really think about how this all kind of exists in the world we live in. and to then call back. Like, I mean, your story again, like I was of course writing notes and I was like, wrote Haiti next to it. And I was like, because that's exactly what it is. It's understanding that we have these texts, these long ago texts that already told us what we should be doing. And it's a painful truth. It's that uncomfortable truth that I was talking about that really, it's just it's the do part that gets really hard for people. And so I really, I think that is the piece that, you get to see what happens in history when someone says, no, but yeah, I want you to pay me back. And when no one stands up and says, please, you can't do this, and the, again, aftermath of what happens when things like that happen. You see an entire nation that's in poverty, and all because they had to pay reparations back to a very wealthy nation. So that was really interesting. I know that there may be questions, and so since we're just bantering and talking because that's what we want to do, is there any questions that I don't know if I can't see the questions? I don't know if there are any questions that came in. We only have a couple minutes left, and I want to make sure that or if Rabbi has any questions. Rabbis.
Well, the questions can be put in the chat. Is that right, Peter? Just so people know how to ask a question. Go ahead and ask, and I think both of our guests will see it. I was wondering, when we spoke preparing for this, you had said a little bit about the bills that are out there that people may want to know a little bit more about to be able to research. Maybe you could just share something brief with us.
Sure.
Whoever.
Yeah. So starting in the 70s, a bill was introduced in the U.S. House of Representatives called H.R. 40. Calling for the creation of a congressional committee to study reparations for descendants of slavery, African Americans more generally, lots of different things. And it sat, it's never been advanced out of committee in the House. But there's been a real sea change in American discourse. At the time that Ta-Nehisi Coates published his article, 2014, there were 32 signatories to H.R. 40. And now there are 194, which means the strong majority of the Democratic caucus has signed this bill. It's still not advanced out of committee, and there's close to a majority in the House to pass it into law, but it's moved from the fringes to the mainstream of our political discussion. Also, a couple of years ago, Senator Cory Booker of New Jersey introduced a companion bill in the Senate for the first time. And there are 22 senators, including both of California's senators, even Senator Feinstein, who's pretty conservative as a Democrat, have both signed it as signatories. They're on record as supporting a congressional committee to study reparations. So that's 44% of the Democratic caucus in the Senate. Not surprisingly, no Republicans are on board for this, but it's become much more of a mainstream, not just in radical or in Black thought, but in liberal politics in the country.
Great.
And I just encourage anyone, if you just Google HR 40, you can read the congressional bill.
Great.
And I dream of a day when, how sometimes when a Jewish community meets with an elected official and they haven't done their homework to know what you're actually trying to meet about, and they assume, well, it's a Jewish community, the only thing the Jewish community cares about is Israel, and they give their prepackaged statement about their support for Israel, even though that's actually one of the most contentious issues in the Jewish community with the most wide range of opinions. But wouldn't it be a great day if, when elected officials haven't done their homework and they're coming to placate a Jewish community, they talk about their support for HR 40 and how they support reparations, because they just know that must be what the Jews are talking to them about, that it's become identical with Jewish politics. From the reading of Torah sources, that should not be hard to imagine.
justiceness. That's how I like to translate tzedakah, justiceness. Question, our wonderful Dorothy always pushes us to think, and she has typed a question here, which I think is the big and unanswered question, but I'll let both of you take a stab at it. She writes, granted reparations are due, what do they look like and who pays? I think that's the part that no one's really figured out, but what do you think?
I mean, I'll go first and say, I think it all depends. I think that there are different groups of people who need different things. I don't think that it's fair for me as a light-skinned Black woman who lives in San Francisco to say that someone who's living in poverty in the South, that I know exactly what they need. That's not fair, and that's really arrogant of me. And so I personally think you got to listen to the people who need it. And, when I look at, the past generations, I say, there are people who made money and who, when you learn about, there's another amazing book called The Color of Money that is about how this country stole money from Black Americans. At the very end of slavery, they stole like what is equivalent to $1 billion from Black people. And so the American government owns that bill. When you're taking money from almost every freed person who is of color in this country and you do not give it back, then you owe money. And so I don't know if that is money for everyone. There might be land for some people. It might be paying off their student loans for others. But there's a lot of different ways that this lives and breathes. And I think that's one of the reasons why the discussion that's happening on the 18th is important, and the coalition that our San Francisco committee is doing is really important work, is because you're starting to learn what different facets of the country and what different facets of this, when we're thinking about San Francisco as a whole, what does that look like when we pushed out most of the people who actually are Black in this city? We pushed them out. Or we put them into the Fillmore and then kicked them out. So what does that look like? That's a very different conversation than someone who's in the South, whose family got lynched and who got their land stolen. That will be my
Thanks, Christina. Yeah, I'll piggyback on that. I agree with that. I think it's a really important question, and I also think there's something really important and elegant in punting the question forward and not getting ahead of ourselves. One of the things that I appreciate most about Coates's article and his many interviews afterward is everyone tries to pin him down and ask, well, how does it look like? What about this problem? What about that? He's like, dude, I'm not an economist. The whole point of HR 40 is that there would be lots of thorny things, like there would probably be an element of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission also, in addition to the monetary elements. And I'm not an expert on that. What I'm able to lay bare is the basic necessity of the case. And what I'm trying to stand on his shoulders and many others and lay bare, our Torah really amplifies that too. And I think that's where religious sources are so useful in actually highlighting major moves of ethical responsibility. In terms of like the specifics, there's an article that I haven't yet written. I've taught a little bit about some halachic, like Jewish legal sources that deal with what would be some of the thorny questions that will inevitably come up about how do you deal with equal distribution of money, or what do you do when the money that's been hoarded by a thief, when the thief is dead and it's been inherited. There are sources like that on a much smaller scale that might help us gesture to imagine, not to be overwhelmed by the fact of the questions, but I think it's actually a genre mistake to expect 3rd century halachic texts that are not written in a nation state context to give like a very granular application. So what I'll say, like, am I punting it forward? Yes. And part of the point is that if HR 40 becomes law, then people who are historians, scholars of international law, scholars of other successful reparation cases that have happened historically, economists will be able to bring forward for important testimony different people who have actually been directly impacted, and they'll be able to do the work. When now I can imagine that there could be lots of broad strokes how it would work. I don't want us to let our fear of those details get in the way of asking questions. As Torah students, the prospect of big questions in front of us should make us hungry. To all the more reason to pass HR 40 so that, wow, the exciting work, the halachic work, if you will, of working out those thorny, difficult questions can actually happen, as opposed to being shrouded.
So I feel like our conversation has just begun, and it has. And it's 6:03, and I want to be respectful of people's time. I'll say that this is a wonderful beginning for many of us. For others, we're deeper into this conversation, but I think being able to put this in the context not only of Jewish texts, as you have for us, Rabbi Bernstein, but also of the experience of real live Jewish people, as you have, Christina. Thank you. Looking at this through a Jewish perspective and a personal perspective, and trying to begin to lay out the questions, because as you've both said, coming up with some answers or going down this road it's a long and winding road to figuring out what next steps might be. But as you so beautifully quoted, Christina, we're not obligated to finish the work, but neither are we free to desist from it. So this is really an engagement that belongs to all of us. And we're so grateful to both of you, our experts, for opening this conversation for us. Thank you for being with us today, all of you. And I want to just remind you and invite you to continue this conversation on Sunday, September 18th, here at Congregation Shereth Israel from 2 to 4 p.m. We have a lot of really interesting speakers coming, and I think it will be sort of the next step and the next conversation in what I hope will be many conversations about this. But this was a wonderful way to begin putting this topic into a Jewish framework. So thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be with you.